Welcome. Nice to see all of you. You've heard of this program before, perhaps, but I'll try to ingrain it in your memory a little better. Who knows what programs will be out there in a year from now. I would say that we have about 60% is radar imaging and target recognition. And I would say that sounds like a technology. That doesn't necessarily sound like science. But whenever I say that, I mean all the sciences behind that would support advance of those technologies. So that's 60%. Maybe about 20% is exotic or a little bit offbeat aspects, both of communications and sensing imaging. We used to have a more substantial commitment in communications. I will go through a bit of the history of that, as could be one of my last talks, so traditionally it's a right to, wax nostalgic all your accomplishments over the years. And the other, so that leaves 20%. That's navigation, geolocation, and timekeeping. In the second paragraph there, we show a little bit more the actualization, how we want to get to some of these goals that I mentioned. A big one is waveform design for diversity and exploitation of the diversity that you created of the waveform. Tied in with that, fully adaptive radar. Being able to use radar in a much more flexible way than you have in the past, sensing the channel, making decisions about the type of target that you're expecting, and altering your parameters accordingly. I don't have too much specifically on the mathematics of target identification. I've briefed that extensively in the past. I'll mention a little bit about the theory of invariance because that's the bigger part of that. And the word I would apply to navigation, geolocation, first of all, GPS independence, if that's possible. The second word is integration. Use everything else you can think of and apply judicious integration. The subtext there is sensor fusion, data fusion, which must be a big area because you've already heard several other programs, especially in RSL, addressing that. And I'm going to address it in other contexts too. This is a slide I think I managed to slip past Dr. Hussey for the reasons, for the archiving reasons that I mentioned. So when I arrived, there wasn't exactly a program with a name. We were more academically organized, and it was called probability and statistics. And then there was a small little activity, basically theoretical signal processing. But it was a big storm afoot, and it was an exciting time to be alive, or at least to arrive at Washington. Wavelets was starting up. And if anybody tells you that wavelets at the AFOSR was principally allied with the physical mathematics activity, that's wrong. It was almost all in, well, of course, we exchanged notes about that. But when Louis Auslander, who was the guru of wavelets at DARPA, set up a lot of projects there, he wanted to be funded himself. My director told me, no, you have to take phone calls from Louis Auslander, not that other program manager. I said, yes, sir, I'm glad to. And after a few conversations, I said, I demand an immediate $5,000 bonus to have to deal with that man, tax-free. but we all got along very well. Here you see some of the gurus of, now I have to learn to do it here, wrong way. Wavelets at the time, RAF equipment became extremely prominent through DARPA programs. And here we have Al Oppenheim, Mr. Digital Signal Processing. Around that time, in conjunction with my director, who was still Dr. Holland at the time, thought it was good to emphasize things that the Air Force are really interested in the title of the program. So signals, communication, and surveillance. Interesting activities took place. We got in touch with a lot of activities at Wright Lab. They were interested in data fusion in the context of rather specific sensors. Putting together forward-looking infrared with laser radar. So a name of Ed Zelnio, many of you know, that was associated with that idea. Also, a more sophisticated form of the wavelet concept applied not only to signaling per se, but all kinds of other aspects where the term, time frequency, but also time scale, and many aspects of control theory where it seemed to be appropriate to pay attention to processes taking place at coarser scales and their relation to finer scales. So Dr. Wilsky, often I will mention the school of Wilsky and others who worked with him. So that was kind of the heyday, and we started a MURI along those lines, which I could call low observables or reduced signature target recognition. Finally, in the early 2000s, the current name came up, and as a gradual thing, most of the communication activities went over to what's now RSL. There was an initiative in networks, especially communication, and that sort of spawned further activities over there. And through an agreement, anyway, a bunch of those are now in Dr. Bonneau's portfolio. Now, interestingly, some that I would have considered communications authorities, especially with MIMO, multiple input, multiple output, who worked on some of those themes in Robert Bonneau's program, have come back to my program. They've learned radar, and they are now the mainstay of MIMO radar. Well, what can you do about such people? They're very smart people out there, and I've been privileged to have a few of them make those kind of transitions and apply relevant mathematical techniques to new areas. Goals. Probably don't want to mention all of them here. Let's look at when I was talking about exotic aspects. Well, that would include passive radar imaging and exploitation of quantum entanglement. Dr. Godfrey, who was director here, suggested that it might not be the best terminology for this technology of looking through clouds and so on to call it ghost imaging. So now I'm gently moving in that direction by talking about electro-optical imaging through quantum entanglement, and perhaps the future will hold similar techniques that would apply to radar. We've had a substantial lab task ongoing utilizing provably or strongly physically covert transmission at higher and higher rates in a context which seemed to be very relevant to the Air Force, transmitting gotcha radar data, for example. And I'll talk a little bit more about the actualization of that. Okay, getting to a somewhat more specific topic, you see where Dr. Carrick in his lead slide got some inspiration from multi-frequency aspirations that we have, better utilization of the spectrum and so on. What can you do in terms of functionality? Different parts of the spectrum are going to be used. So designing the waveforms and utilizing them in the most effective way is the general theme behind this vision, which we could call waveform diversity. All right. Who are we working with? Long-term connections with our friends at ARL, upstairs at ONR, and so on. I would mention in particular follow-ons to sensing initiatives, which was there was one led by Dr. Cochran at DARPA. Actually, that kind of got off the ground through a grant he had with me before he became a DARPA officer, active sensing. And now there are some continuations of that with Dr. Falcone at DARPA. We're going to revisit, as I did at the last SAB that I fully participated in, I think was 2007, 3D modeling. There was DARPA follow-on programs of these various names associated with the Visi building and so on. I also want to say something about international efforts that we have been participating with. One that was signed recently on the topic of noise waveform radar with the DRDC Ottawa, where actually the Canadians are paying some of our researchers. So we're happy about that. And also kickoff meetings that were held in Hawaii, hoping that some fruition would take place with the Singaporeans, and that's now well underway. Either an MOU has been signed or it's about to. So we'd be working there. We have a stateside component paid for partly with my funds and partly with international office funds, and then there's going to be a Singapore component. Probably they'll end up paying most of that. Can't go over all of these, and some specifics will come up in discussion of the actual programs. Let me talk about distributed SAR, because I did give some briefings on this in previous SAB, and also at least one brown bag, which was a full hour lecture. So at least my colleagues got their fair share of exposure to making use of synthetic aperture radar in a broader geometric context, taking full advantage of the type of reflection on terrain, and it ties in very neatly with established mathematical theory of linear partial differential equations and so-called wavefront sets that was set up on a theoretical basis in the 60s by the Swedish mathematician Hermander and Sato, Yves Mayer, and others. Here is a neat little result which I like to use as an example. Eugene Wigner wrote this famous essay on the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Also, perhaps it was him that said, well, the benefit of applications is that it sometimes leads to an interesting mathematical theorem. Now, some of you may feel this point of view is a bit extreme. I certainly don't. But in this case, it worked out because we were looking at the problem, the researchers at Ohio University and Miami University of Ohio, the question of whether you can safely neglect multipath components of the GPS signal in your particular situation. So for large multipath effects, you can employ signal processing. and solve the problem there. But if the multipath effects are smaller angles and so on, you have to adopt a different statistical approach. So in that case, it turned out there was an open statistical problem of distributions. In fact, whether this F distribution has the property called centrality. Basically amounts to whether a bunch of sample means are going to imply under a hypothesis test that all the means can be taken to be equal or not. Well, that relates to the centrality of this so-called F distribution. So under the old scheme, you have to do many table lookups to confirm that or not, but it actually was possible to find a closed form solution to that. So you had a definite breakthrough in statistical methods based on the fact that you want to solve this particular problem is very relevant to GPS. Okay, speaking of GPS, actually, this is sort of a non-GPS slide. In other words, if you don't have global positioning available, what do you do? So the approach here taken is combining laser scanning of the ground, like is done by your copy machine and so on, the same kind of light scanning with other resources that will help you keep that better calibrated. And as you know, the inertial measurement unit, the accelerometers and so on that you'd have in an airplane or missile and so on, those have drift and should be relied on for very long. But you can recalibrate them at the same time when you've achieved sufficient fixation on objects on the ground, for example. So actually, the laser scanning approach and the IMU work hand in hand, but they're difficult sensor fusion problems because everything is at vastly disparate scales and so on. Tests and experiments have been done using this hovercraft. It's a 4-rotor craft. Now, I wish I had a neat movie of this like we saw the other day. A similar craft was going up in the air. I thought that was extremely exciting. I do have another movie, perhaps a little less exciting later, which I hope you also give full attention to. But actually, the control theory, the control aspects of this gadget were not trivial either. Ended up using a quaternion-based control, and the main designer was at that time an AFOT student, Mike Stepanek. I don't know him personally. I believe he's a professor at AFOT now. Okay, now we come to the ionosphere, and this is a difficult area for me. Anyway, we learned a lot about the effects on signals of perturbations in the ionosphere and so on. That's also what this is about. But the slightly varying aspect is study the ionosphere by means of GPS signals, not merely worry about what the ionosphere is doing to the GPS. So this is a fairly serious project with a large experimental component. You want to make full use of the HARP facility here up in Alaska, and I guess that these are the transmitters for HARP. Well, what it basically does is you can pick out portions of the ionosphere to heat up, and that will produce the scintillations that you want to study. In case you didn't have enough scintillations to start with, whereas at certain times you might have plenty. Here, if you look carefully, you'll see Greenland in here somewhere. Yeah, here's Greenland. So this is actually kind of a map showing high electron density regions. So I defer to Dr. Fiesen if some of this is slightly inaccurate, but it's what I've been able to work with. An example of how the heating pattern from HARP might proceed. So they actually go up to Alaska a lot and use the receiving facilities there as well, and try to glom on when they're going to cook up part of the ionosphere in any case. All right, here's a little bit more along the same vein. Now, here we see two kinds of satellites. For some reason, this brown GPS is supposed to be green. So if you just look at the green satellites, it leaves a little bit larger hole. You're going to get more data if you also use the red ones. So what are the red ones? Those are GLONASS satellites from Russia. So exploitation of other similar to GPS satellites is part and parcel of this experimental scheme. So what are you aiming for? Characterize as much as you can about the scintillation. Part of it is electromagnetic modeling, the way I understand. The significance of O and X rays, not X rays, but X waves, extraordinary and so on. It's been pointed out that that's been neglected in the literature, and some conclusions were reached about those propagations that were not strictly right. So we want to set that right. Also, statistical modeling is essential, because you're never going to have as close an electromagnetic picture. What's happening is plasma bubbles form, and so on. It's the ultimate source of scintillation. The basic model, I guess, depends on electron density and the magnetic lines of force that are going through that particular area. Now, there are several GPS signals, and if you have two of them, you can avoid the worst of first-order effects. But the point is, experiments are tending to show that you have to take into account second-order effects. Also, the L5, which is kind of associated with critical functions, life-saving functions, and so on, seems to be equally, if not more, vulnerable to ionospheric perturbations than the others. So that's a little bit of a disturbing realization. Okay. Here are really two topics. Under the broad supervision of Dr. Rangaswamy at RY, who also has a lab task with me, of course. But these are two very strong professors working in different aspects of space-time adaptive processing. So what that is well, phase array radar is the first step, and then if you throw in a range Doppler sensing combination and the various adaptive forms of that, then you've got STAP. And the state of the art has advanced even beyond that. So the first theme is how to make a solution for the kind of STAP evaluations that you need more effective than in the past. The other problem is kind of a data fusion situation where you're dealing with multiple sensors in a fairly unique context, which I'll spell out. Okay, well, what it comes down to when you're establishing weights for the idealized matched filter that will allow you to recognize the signal that you're expecting, you have to invert this matrix, which is a covariance matrix. As you imagine, that's prone to problems of conditioning, and it's just computationally intensive in the first place. So a type of conjugate gradient method seems to be indicated, and it seems to work much better. Here we can make some comparisons with real-world data coming out of the DARPA CASPER program from 2004, around there. And before that, we had McCarm data coming out of Rome Lab, RADC at one time. seems that at this point there should be an object detected, and the methods that were based on conjugate gradient brought the object out of clutter in a much clearer way, conspicuous way than the other methods. All these top three are related conjugate gradient, and the others are more classical. This one, AMF, didn't even register the target, so you had to give that a grade of X. These were also comparison of classical and the new methods. What it means is that if you reach the peak of observation at a low rank, that means that you're going to need a lot less training data to make the thing work, which is a very critical thing in the current context. You want the systems to work without having a lot of pre-training undergoing. The other research effort involves the data fusion, as I mentioned, and this forms a context of a particular statistical situation. Let's say it's a simple decision or hypothesis test, H0, H1, the target is present or the target is absent. You have sample statistics from each of the sensors, and you may have a certain amount of information about joint distributions. But maybe you just have the joint distribution information under one of the hypotheses, but not the other. And you have some other statistical information under the other hypothesis, okay? How to combine those? Well, an analytical artifice called exponentially embedded families seems to do the job very well. To my mind, it's representing PDFs, probability distribution functions, as kind of exponential sums. What it turns out is that the measure of deviation from the true distribution that you're aiming at and the one that is more easily computable moves asymptotically to zero. So it has a very neat form in terms of statistics. And as I claim again, looking at radar problems, for example, or decision detection problems has led to advances in abstract statistics. So minimizes Kullback-Leibler divergence from the true answer. And the implementation is practical. So I really love these curves, which they're showing you about 4 methods, but they all lie on the same curve. So then I just make some argument like, well, they perform equally well, but one of them must be computationally much easier to carry out. So I guess I just said it, right? You don't have any particular question about that? Thank you. Well, these are mostly, this is a receiver operating curve here, so it measures false alarm probability versus actual detection probability. Here, it's detection versus the sort of inverse of the noise power. Now, the method was designed under a Gaussian regime, so you would expect it to work well where all the noise is Gaussian and so on. But just to be sure, you tested it under a number of other regimes and also worked great, okay? Even though it was non-Gaussian. So that's a serendipity. Definitely, that's a technology boost. Oh yeah, that's where I want to bring in Wigner's statement about mathematics works better than you might expect it to, and sometimes a technological fix based on sound basis like linear algebra and so on also works better where you wouldn't necessarily expect it to do so. All right, now this is I'm not very good at these where you have to click through. I briefed Avide Zakor's work several times before. She's made tremendous progress since that time. In fact, you may remember a little bit about Dr. Zakor and her trucks and vans running around the streets of Berkeley and scanning the fronts of buildings. And then, of course, you had to get the top of the building, so she'd fly over with helicopters and planes. That was a hard part because it was an extremely difficult optimization problem to get the roof put on just right and so on. Well, she couldn't get continued funding for that, but that's all right. Google Earth walked in, took over all the equipment, bought a license, and now their trucks are running all over the world. In fact, 50 cities, worldwide cities, have a similar method, all based on her stuff, of course, locked into, you can go in and look 3D. In other words, you can pick up the corner of a building and see what it looks like behind and so on. This has obvious, many military uses. I'm going to get to what we're going to do is even more clearly military relevant. So, you know, talk about a transition, that's a really big one, I would claim. What's going on here is the best you can do sort of in an indoor situation is have this little guy roam around and scan. And so you're going to end up with something that looks like a stencil diagram or blueprint or something. It's not going to be of that much help for the commando team to jump in a window, you know, how do I get to the 5th floor and so on, where's the stairwell? So we want to be able to do all that. So to effect it, you need ambulatory reconnaissance unit. Now I could say a lot of things about how many degrees of freedom that with the wheeled vehicle. One good thing about wheeled vehicle is you can tell how far it rolled. But basically you're just operating in X, Y coordinates and maybe some yaw. Whereas in roaming around the interior that has stairs and everything, you're probably going to have to deal with X, Y, Z, pitch, roll, and yaw. And the ambulatory aspects of the human is complex, as is probably well known to people who study that stuff. Here's our ambulatory reconnaissance unit. His name is Steve. And his backpack has various laser scanners, cameras. Because you have a big problem with the yaw, here's a gyroscope system which is based on fiber optic gyro, very expensive. They bought some of it with DURIP money, but in the actual implementation, you won't have to use the expensive one. They did all the experimentation with the computer that runs this HG 9900, and now you can build a much smaller backpack that, okay, in case you didn't get it by now, the boy runs around the hall, and he doesn't have to particularly do anything, just sort of go everywhere there is to go, up and down the stairs and so on, and it scans and will produce a model. All right, I want to show there's some science involved in here, right? Problems involve like, how are you going to match certain parts of the model? Here's the same door, but they should match up. And if you just use the laser scans to try to do that, it becomes insuperable. You have to use the whole picture. But there's some theory on how to do that. Actually, it comes down to modeling it with Markov random fields. And the combinatorial optimization problem that you're faced with is essentially equivalent to the famous problem of graph cuts. An arbitrary graph. What is the worst way that you can color some of the nodes so that you require the maximal number of cuts to separate the colored ones from the uncolored ones? Maybe it's an NP-hard problem, but there are suboptimal ways to do it, and that's what Abide is employing. Okay, so first step is you acquire a point cloud from the backpack traipsing through. Now, 70% of the research, she said, was data fusion, figuring out what the orientation of the backpack was at the right time. Okay? 60% of the computation is also figuring out those things to be able to produce the right pixel so that you have the depiction to this level. If you wanted this thing that looks like a space station, but actually you see very clearly that this is the 2 floors and the stairwell and everything. This would be the finished model. Remaining challenges, but we're running a little low on time here. All right, here's the movie that I produced. Now, instead of the nice film of the basketball game we had the other day and that hovering craft, I'm presenting to you a movie of a view of a water tower. But as some of us know, even at the front desk, I believe there are individuals here who've climbed that very water tower, as have I. So I won't go into the legend of the federal employee who wanders around that part of Prince George's County, and you know, it's Navy property, but there's a gap in the fence and you can sort of climb up there and so on. But it's become a classic, just like the Ingrid picture and so on, for fusing together imperfect views, of which there may be many frames. Basically, there are 2 ways to approach it. One is adaptive optics that most of you know about, but that's very expensive, and it was just mentioned that probably no new Starfire is going to be built. So maybe you can solve the problem 99% with software. So that's the idea. I don't know whether he's going to run or not. Just let them run if they want. See, I thought there was a name on here. No? How do I make it go back? There we are. That the previously used software method was called lucky frame. So the idea was, once in a while you get a really sharp frame, just keep it, okay? That's probably the one to use. Unfortunately, it doesn't come up as often as you would need. So this researcher, Payman Milanfar, he's a past master at everything you could think of for image reconstruction. So he says, oh, lucky region, lucky frame, why didn't I think of that? So he applies all his other techniques. Instead of just waiting for the nice region to come along, he performed some deconvolution and so on in a judicious way. Especially, not much had been done even on the registration of the images frame to frame. So he applied that with a vengeance, and now you have a method that works just as well. As you see, you've got a very crisp picture over here in a shorter length of time. Here we have quantum covert encryption. I've talked about it before. Let me just mention that the experiments that have gone on with high rate downloading of gotcha dual radar data has been proceeding. Now there's a DARPA activity sort of taken over from there, so I could claim that Dr. Hughes has really affected a fine transition, and he remains involved in it himself. I wanted to talk about range Doppler discrimination, GOLAY codes, and so on, but I guess we're going to have to leave that for the distant future. Anyway, you can gaze upon these fine gentlemen who are pioneers in waveforms, Fourier analysis, and radar.
And you're done.
Well, if you tell me I am.
Yeah, I think you're done. Thank you, Dr. Sjogren. and we've left enough time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, if there are any questions.
Actually, it's a comment. When you had the picture of the water tower and grabbed the best image, that reminded me a little bit about what's called speckle imaging in astronomy, where you're grabbing 30 frames a second and then you're bringing them together to try to improve an image, and this is not adaptive optics, but you're looking for the best shots. And I'm wondering if you've looked at that.
No, I haven't specifically. However, is it reputed that that kind of method in astronomy is not particularly resistant to noise that may be in the system? That was reputedly a drawback of just a purely lucky frame, lucky region method.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sjogren.
We can get to these.